Tonight we're plunging headfirst into the steamy, chaotic world of medieval kitchens, specifically, the odd but strangely majestic phenomenon of why cooks back then wielded spoons the size of canoe paddles. Imagine a hot, smoky room jammed with shouting, sweating people, and somewhere in the back, a lone figure stirring a massive cauldron with something that looks like it could double as emergency boat equipment. You're about to find out why. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not post your location and the local time in the comments? I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck under a low wooden beam, trying not to bonk your head on the dangling garlic braids, and step into the kitchen of a bustling 14th century manor. The air hits you like a casserole, thick with smoke, roasted meat, and the undeniable tang of centuries-old grease. A dozen cooks zip past in linen tunics, shouting about capons, eel pies, and something suspiciously named blancmange. And then you see it leaning casually against a barrel like it's waiting for a rowing crew, a spoon as long as your arm and wider than your thigh. It's not just one. They're everywhere, some hung from hooks, others resting beside monstrous blackened pots. You're in a world where spoons are not handheld objects. They're tools, weapons, symbols, possibly even misunderstood religious relics. Your modern mind flinches. Who needs a spoon that big? Is it for eating an ogre's cereal? Is there a medieval rowboat missing one of its oars? You inch closer to one of the pots and peer in. Inside is what looks like the culinary equivalent of a swamp. Stew. Maybe. Possibly a soup. There's a chicken foot bobbing next to what looks like an entire parsnip that's given up on life. The spoon, when lifted, drips slowly, syrupy, like it spent a long time reconsidering its career choices. You grab the handle, instantly regretting it, because it's hot and sticky, and try to lift it. Nope. This isn't your grandma's ladle. This is a two-hander, the kind you could feasibly joust with if your opponent had equally low standards. One of the cooks gives you a look and chuckles. He mumbles something about keeping the bottom from burning. You nod like you understand. You do not. But you're beginning to see that these oversized spoons weren't some quirk, they were a necessity. See, the average cooking pot in a medieval kitchen could hold gallons of liquid. We're talking enough to serve dozens, sometimes hundreds, especially in castles or monasteries. And unlike modern stovetops, these bad boys sat over open fires. If you got too close, you weren't just in danger of a singed eyebrow, you risked becoming part of the stew. Hence, the giant spoons. It was a safety feature. Functional, like medieval PPE. Paddling stew from a safe distance was a literal lifesaver. Mainstream historians agree, the size of these utensils grew out of practicality. In large-scale kitchens, especially noble or royal ones, cooks worked with massive vats, which demanded reach. Plus, the heat radiating off those flames could melt your soul. Having 3 feet of wooden handle between you and the bubbling meat mystery? That's survival. And don't imagine these spoons as uniform factory-made things. Each was crafted by hand, often from ash, elm, or beechwood woods that wouldn't splinter in hot liquid and could withstand repeated dunkings in boiling goo. Some even had decorated handles. One example, preserved in a German museum, has little notches carved along the length, likely a cook's way of marking batches or, possibly, keeping tally of how many times they had threatened someone with it. Now, whether these spoons were always made for cooking, or whether some evolved from older agricultural tools, like grain paddles, is still up for debate. Historians argue whether certain surviving examples were actually repurposed, or created specifically for food prep. But once they entered the kitchen, they became icons of the trade. Still, you wonder why keep them so long? Why not invent a smaller, cleverer system? Well, first of all, Plumbing hadn't quite made its way into the average castle. If you wanted to cook something, you were doing it over a bonfire in what was basically an indoor chimney. These spoons weren't just for stirring, they were for scraping, for flipping, for occasionally smacking the apprentice when they dropped the spices again. And let's not ignore the fringe theories. One curious text from the 16th century describes a cook who carried his great spoon as if it were a badge of office. Was it ceremonial? Was the biggest spoon reserved for the head cook, like a weird wooden scepter? Unconfirmed, but deeply satisfying to imagine. You walk past a bench stacked with trenchers, thick slabs of bread doubling as plates, and past a sweating teen desperately trying to peel onions without crying in front of his crush. Next to him, a cook stirs a pot of barley with a paddle that looks like it's been through a siege. The end is blackened, slightly warped, and covered in a sheen of something that's either old stew or pure regret. And here's a fun twist: not all the spoons stayed in the kitchen. Some traveled. Traveling cooks, camp cooks for armies, or those working in mobile feasting tents during festivals or tournaments, they carried their own gear. Imagine riding into town with a rolled-up apron and a spoon strapped to your back like a lumberjack's axe. Street cred. Oh yeah. You lean against a barrel of something pickled and exhale slowly. There's music outside, lute and drum, and above you, a wooden beam with a crack just wide enough for a rat to squeeze through. You try not to think about it. Your eye catches one more spoon, this one with a carved handle ending in a small, crude duck head. It's a little worn. Someone loved this spoon. You realize something quietly strange: these weren't just tools. They were companions in the chaos. Spoons that had seen births, feasts, weddings, plague, famine. Carried by hands that blistered and bled. Washed, poorly, in buckets of cold ash water. Stirred again. Reused. Retired only when they snapped or burned or vanished mysteriously, like runaway monks. And as the kitchen roars on around you, you take one last look at that massive ladle resting on its hook and think, yeah, that thing earned its place. You inch deeper into the kitchen, drawn by the soft gurgle of something monumental simmering nearby. The noise shifts from background clatter to a singular, hypnotic rhythm: bloop, bloop, bloop. A huge pot squats on an iron tripod, its belly rounded and blackened from countless meals, or possibly mild arson. This, you realize, is not a cooking pot. It is a cauldron. A cauldron so big it could double as a medieval hot tub for 4, or a baptismal font for particularly daring congregations. A cook stands beside it, barefoot and red-faced, wielding what is unmistakably a spoon built for titans. Its handle stretches longer than your arm, its bowl big enough to serve as a backup helmet. He stirs with the full-body motion of a blacksmith. One foot braces forward, both hands twist the handle, and his shoulder dips low to drive the scoop through whatever eldritch substance simmers within. It's part soup, part gravy, part, let's be honest, no one really knows anymore. This, you learn, is why spoons were so massive, because medieval cookware wasn't cookware, it was industrial. Castles, manors, monasteries, even some towns used communal kitchens to feed crowds. And that meant volume. Gallons upon gallons of thick, grain-laden, meat-speckled stew. Pottage, they called it. A name that sounds humble, like something your aunt might microwave. But this stuff could stop time. Your boots stick slightly as you move. The floor is sticky. Always sticky. You glance down and note a sheen of something amber and vaguely gelatinous. You will not ask. You will not know. The cook wipes his brow and mutters something about barley clumps. He's been stirring since dawn. This pot. Just one of 3. The spoon. It's not just for mixing. He uses it to skim scum, to fish out bones, to bash together stuck grain at the bottom like he's fighting a doughy kraken. The fire under the cauldron spits occasionally, sending up bursts of orange that graze the pot's belly like dragon breath. You flinch, and that's when it clicks. These spoons aren't oversized out of some weird medieval kink, they're shields. Barriers. Tools to keep cooks from catching fire while feeding 80 angry mouths. They offer space, critical space, between your face and a scalding eruption of turnip soup. It's not just about size. It's about material. Most spoons of this scale were carved from greenwood, fresh-cut, pliable wood that wouldn't crack or warp under heat. Others were reinforced with iron at the base. Some even had double handles for added torque, a sort of two-player video game controller but for barley porridge. The design was born from experience, and also trial by fire. Literally. The origins of these culinary behemoths, however, are murky. Historians still argue whether the first cauldron spoons evolved from agricultural paddles used to stir mash for animals, or if they came from brewing tools in early ale production. The overlap is real. Ale, gruel, and stew all shared similar ingredients, cooking processes, and general mystery meat vibes. There's even a theory that some early spoons were just short oars with delusions of kitchen grandeur. One fringe theory, that these massive spoons were actually status tools long before they were practical ones. A cook in a big household didn't just make food, they controlled the gate between hunger and happiness. The bigger the spoon, the bigger the power. It's a bit like walking into a boardroom with a laptop that glows intimidating, mysterious, and just tetchy enough that no one questions your authority. You spot a second spoon resting against the cauldron's rim, this one carved with loops and swirls. Decorative, yes, but you notice the bowl is flatter and wider than the first. It's a skimmer, a spoon designed not to stir, but to lift impurities from the surface. And while the term impurities is generous, let's agree that floating sinew and mystery foam deserve their own category. Nearby, another pot roils. A younger cook approaches it like it's a sleeping bear, lowers a similar oversized spoon, and lifts with a soft grunt. It's heavier than it looks. The ladle drips with thick lentils and what might be rabbit. Could be turnip. Could be regret. You lean closer and sniff. It's oddly appealing, like winter stew laced with wood smoke. Comforting, if you don't stare too long at the floating bits. You realize suddenly, this isn't cooking in the modern sense. This is batch feeding, mass survival, edible logistics. These spoons are lifelines, stretched between fire and flesh. And they weren't only for stirring. Oh no. These same paddles were used to portion food. To scrape out the final dregs for a visiting noble. To beat dough. To slap hands, and occasionally thieves. In some kitchens, they were the official tool of discipline. Legend tells of a cook in Kent who whacked a drunk squire with a spoon so large it left a dent in his helmet. You can't make that up. Except, someone probably did. By the door, a small child, likely a scullery servant, sits polishing a third spoon, this one smaller but still absurd by modern standards. She dips it into a trough of greyish water, then scrubs the bowl with a cloth that's seen better centuries. She sees you watching and gives a tired smile. This one's the pudding spoon, she says proudly. You nod as if that clarifies anything. The pudding spoon, you learn, was used for softer, sweeter dishes, thick custards, grain-based desserts, occasionally fruits poached in wine. Yes, medieval kitchens had desserts, too, though they usually involved more spices than your local donut shop. You imagine this massive spoon scooping up thick plum porridge, dishing it out with ceremony to guests who probably hadn't bathed in a week but did appreciate a warm treat. You take a step back, the heat wrapping around you like a greasy blanket, and listen to the sounds again. Wood scraping iron. Fire crackling. The bubbling hiss of broth just about to spill. The spoon, impossibly large, carves gentle spirals in the liquid. It's not elegant, but it's rhythmic. Repetitive. Almost soothing. For a brief second, you forget the filth. Forget the rats in the rafters. You watch the spoon work, over and over, and think, this is the heartbeat of the household. Not the lord with his hunting dogs. Not the lady with her embroidery. This. The pot. The paddle. The hands that keep it moving. And suddenly, it makes perfect sense why the spoon had to be this big. The scent shifts. There's something new in the air now, sharper, meatier, with a faint twang of onions that have surrendered to the fire. You pivot toward the sauce, only to be nearly run over by a squat, barrel-chested man carrying 2 buckets of something that sloshes ominously. He barks at someone behind you, jabs a finger toward one of the larger cauldrons, and gestures with what appears to be a different type of spoon, this one even longer, with a flat, paddle-like end. He's not just cooking. He's commanding. You've wandered into a full-scale operation. You find a corner and watch the choreography unfold. It's like a medieval kitchen flash mob, cooks moving between stations, each focused, each moving with the urgency of someone who knows that if the meat burns, they may have to serve it to a knight anyway and endure a very public scolding. This isn't a kitchen for a family. This is a kitchen for a force. 40 mouths, minimum. You count them mentally: the lord, his household, squires, guards, pages, priests, guests, their animals, their servants, and of course the army of cooks themselves. This single meal needs to feed an entire medieval ecosystem. And all of it, every trencher, every scoop of barley, every stew-slopped bowl is being portioned, stirred, and sometimes threatened into submission by the great spoons. You watch as 3 cooks gather around a vat of what looks like a medieval chicken rice porridge situation. It's thick, lumpy, mildly alive. The lead cook lifts his spoon with a grunt, resting it across the shoulders of 2 assistants as they prepare for the final stir. This isn't just cooking, it's teamwork. And that spoon? It's long enough to span all 3 men, like a culinary bridge. The bowl of the spoon glides slowly through the mix, dragging stubborn bits up from the bottom. You can hear it scraping the pot. That scrape is intentional. The danger with cooking this much food, especially over inconsistent fire, is the dreaded burn layer. One false move, and you've got blackened sludge stuck to the bottom, tainting every spoonful with that unmistakable oops flavor. So they stir. Constantly. Ritualistically. And with spoons that can sweep the bottom of a pot you could rent out as an Airbnb experience. One of the apprentices, no older than 16, starts dishing out the finished pottage with a second oversized spoon, a serving ladle this time, more bowl than handle, worn smooth from decades of hot barley. He moves like he's been trained to do this in his sleep. A half turn, a scoop, a tip. Each ladleful lands into a rough wooden bowl. And then another. And another. 25 in a row. No weighing. No measuring. Just muscle memory and the weight of repetition. Historians still argue whether these spoons were standardized within big kitchens or hand-fitted for individual cooks. Some believe there were early attempts at rationing tools, ladles calibrated by scoops per peasant, while others argue that each spoon was as unique as the cook who wielded it, carved with flair and function in equal measure. A few rare finds have initials, notches, or even embedded coins in the handles. Personal flair? Maybe. Kitchen politics? Almost definitely. You spot a small chalkboard or something pretending to be one, scratched with names and numbers. Rations. Meal counts. Bowl sizes. The spoon is more than a utensil, it's a measuring stick. And in the wrong hands, it's also a power move. You think back to that apprentice, was he just ladling food? Or was he deciding who got more meat and who got mostly onions? There's a subtle pecking order in the kitchen, and the one with the ladle is king, for now. And it's not just soup. A massive iron skillet sits nearby, crackling with some kind of seared meat cakes. A cook is using a flat wooden spoon the size of a pizza peel to flip each sizzling patty. It's hot, greasy, and loud. But that oversized spoon does the trick. It slides under the cakes without crumbling them, catches drippings, and even serves as a spatula and tray all in one. Fringe enthusiasts have long speculated that these spoons evolved into multi-purpose culinary weapons, part spoon, part shield, part disciplinary tool. In some wild stories, they doubled as instruments of punishment. A lazy apprentice might be lightly walloped with the flat side. Lovingly, of course. You glance up and catch a tiny smile pass between two cooks as one playfully threatens the other with a spoon tap. It's affection in the form of exaggerated menace. The kitchen is full of stress, sweat, and noise, but there's humor, too. Cooks teasing each other. Someone hiding an onion under a hat. Someone else pretending to joust with a spoon and a pork shank. Because when you cook for 40, you have to stay sane somehow. And it's not like today's food service where you clock out at 5 and go home to a microwave. This is a living kitchen. A rotating chaos engine. These people sleep in adjoining rooms or the hallway. Meals come in waves, breakfast stew, midday barley, dinner meats, and the work never really stops. The spoon never rests. It just leans against the wall for a moment, steaming. You step back, eyes sweeping across the workspace. The main cauldron still bubbles. The skillet sizzles. The ladle swings. There's a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence to it all. And then there's the storage area. You slip past the curtain and find something strange, a rack. Just a wooden rack. But it holds spoons of every shape and size. Some flat like paddles, others concave like modern ladles, all long-handled and battle-scarred. The rack is organized loosely by function, stirring, skimming, flipping, dishing. It's like a tool chest, except everything is at least 3 feet long and smells vaguely of onions and smoked ham. You pick up a particularly well-used one. Its handle is worn smooth from years of grip. The bowl is blackened, not from neglect, but from fire and time. It feels less like a spoon and more like a memory. You imagine it in action, scraping stew, slapping dough, ladling meals to monks or soldiers or weepy wedding guests. You almost don't want to put it back. And that's when it hits you. In a place where knives were sharpened, tempers flared, and fire never stopped burning, the spoon, absurdly large, utterly specific, was the one thing every cook trusted most. The kitchen begins to quiet, just slightly, as the midday frenzy tapers off. But your curiosity refuses to rest. You drift toward a smaller side room, cordoned off by a draped linen sheet darkened with soot. You duck inside. Here, things feel different. Calmer. There's a sense of ceremony. An older man sits on a stool near the hearth, hunched but regal in posture, inspecting what can only be described as the king of spoons. The handle gleams faintly under the flicker of firelight, not because it's polished, but because it's silver. Yes, silver. You take a half step back, almost reverent. And then you notice another spoon hanging above the mantel, ivory, long and delicate, etched with swirling patterns of vines and roses. It's not quite as long as the other paddles you've seen, but still absurd by modern standards. And unmistakably luxurious. Apparently, spoons weren't just tools. They were status symbols. In the world of medieval kitchens, where most tools were basic and battered, a spoon like this stood out like a crown at a farmhand's wedding. It said something about the person wielding it, or, more often, the person who owned the kitchen. These spoons weren't for everyday stew duty. They were for show, feasts, ceremonial occasions. When food had to be served with flair, not just heat. The man on the stool finally speaks, voice cracked like old parchment. That one, he says, gesturing to the silver ladle, was used to serve the Duke's coronation soup. He smiles, as if coronation soup is a perfectly normal phrase that needs no follow-up. You nod solemnly anyway. Spoons of this kind were rare, but real. Wealthy households, and especially noble kitchens, often commissioned such pieces for banquets or diplomatic feasts. They were functional, yes, but also ornamental, like a giant edible tiara. During banquets, the head cook might use one of these to serve the Lord's dish personally, lifting it like a relic before gently pouring its contents into a gilded bowl. And heaven forbid you spill. That's the kind of mistake that ends with you in the pigsty, or worse, reassigned to the turnip cellar. You glance at a third spoon resting on a shelf. This one is wood, but inlaid with copper rings along the shaft. Strange, because copper isn't great in heat, it bends, it tarnishes. So why use it? A little digging reveals the truth. It wasn't just decoration. It was identity. Some cooks, particularly head chefs of large estates, personalized their spoons like knights did swords. They'd add embellishments, initials, sometimes even symbols, crosses, lions, stars. Each spoon was part badge of office, part secret flex. And you thought modern chefs with monogrammed knives were showing off. One fringe theory, though tantalizing, is that some of these ornate spoons were used in semi-ritualistic ways. Certain feast records mention the opening stir, where a designated cook stirred the first round of pottage before guests entered, symbolically blending ingredients as one. Was this legit? Historians still argue whether these mentions were literal events or just poetic language. Either way, the idea of a spoon being part of a public ritual isn't so far-fetched. Especially when the spoon looks like it could double as a bishop's scepter. You run a finger down the ivory handle. The craftsmanship is absurd: spirals, vines, little notches that might be tally marks or just the artisan showing off. You wonder who carved it. A royal woodturner? A bored monk with access to questionable materials? Whoever it was, they weren't just making spoons, they were making statements. And here's the thing no one tells you about status spoons: they didn't always stay in the kitchen. During large feast days, they were sometimes carried into the banquet hall. Like, actually paraded. Imagine a long table groaning with roast peacock, jellied eel, and those decorative sugar castles people inexplicably ate, and then, with dramatic flair, the master cook enters, holding a 6-foot ladle like it's Excalibur. The crowd hushes. The spoon dips into a glowing vat of almond cream. A hush falls over the room. Okay, maybe a bit of that is theatre. But the theatre mattered. In medieval culture, food was spectacle. It was wealth. It was power. And who held the biggest, prettiest spoon in the room? Not the knights. Not the clergy. The cook. That spoon meant you were trusted. That you had tasted the stew and declared it ready. That you wouldn't poison the guests, intentionally or otherwise. The spoon was authority, polished into a point. You're still marveling at the thought when someone brings in yet another spoon, this one wrapped in cloth. The cook unfolds it slowly, revealing a darker wood with gold inlay along the edges. It's scorched, clearly used, but beautiful in its own right. You ask if this one is for display, too. No, the cook replies. This one's only for guests. Which, ironically, doesn't mean the guests use it. It means it's used when cooking for them. VIP spoon. This is the kind of kitchen where every spoon has a name, or at least a nickname. Big ladle. Dragon tail. The blessed stirrer. You chuckle at the thought until someone actually refers to one as Old Chomper, and you're not sure if they're joking. You're also beginning to understand the very human urge to elevate everyday things. A spoon, after all, is simple, unassuming. But when it's tied to feast, ceremony, or the whims of nobility, it becomes a symbol of craftsmanship, of control, of culinary sorcery. And not every cook got to wield these. Only the best. The head cook, the steward, maybe a favorite apprentice if they were lucky. It was like being handed the keys to the kingdom, except the key was shaped like a canoe and reeked of thyme and garlic. Before you leave the side room, you notice one last spoon mounted near the door. Smaller, humbler. Just wood and a smooth bowl. No embellishments. But next to it is a scrap of parchment, pinned with wax, bearing the words, "For the final stir, always by her hand." No context. No date. Just that. You stare at it, oddly touched. Because even in a world of status and ceremony, the simplest spoon still held meaning. And as you step back into the main kitchen and watch a cook twirl a ladle like it's part of a dance, you finally get it. The spoon wasn't just big. It was important. You hear a rhythmic tap, tap, tap echoing from deeper inside the manor, following a faint scent of sawdust and sap. It's oddly soothing, like someone gently knocking on the walls of time. Curious, you follow the noise away from the fire and stew steam, past shelves of onions and wheels of aging cheese, until it leads you outside into the courtyard. There, seated cross-legged beneath a crooked canopy, is the woodworker. Shirt sleeves rolled, fingers stained with resin, and a chunk of raw timber balanced on his lap. And in his hand, the beginnings of a spoon, long, curved, with a handle already stretching nearly the length of his arm. He doesn't glance up as you approach. Just nods once and keeps carving, each stroke precise, methodical, as if he's not shaping wood but coaxing something ancient from it. You crouch beside him and watch. The wood shavings curl like ribbons. The tool he uses isn't quite a knife, not quite a chisel, some hybrid blade worn to perfection. Every few moments, he pauses to turn the piece, squinting like it might suddenly confess its destiny to him. "This one's for lentils," he murmurs eventually. "Not to you, necessarily. Just to the air. Needs a softer bowl. Too much curve and it traps the mash." It hits you. These spoons weren't mass-produced. They were bespoke. Crafted by hand. Measured against experience, not blueprints. The choice of wood alone was practically alchemy. Birch was smooth and resilient. Ash held up against repeated dunkings. Beech was common and cooperative. Yew, rare, but strong, rumored to be used only for spoons destined for royal tables. And elm, well, if you had the time to let it cure properly and the patience not to curse its twisting grain, elm made a fine ladle for thick broths. You ask how long it takes to make one. He grins, not looking up. "A day if I'm rushed. A week if I care." He means it. Each spoon starts as a branch, not a board. Carved green, when the wood is still soft, then hung above smoke or laid out under eaves to dry slowly, gracefully. Too fast and it'll split. Too slow and it warps. Sometimes, spoons were soaked in oil after shaping. Others were sanded with leather scraps. Occasionally, a cook would return one for a reshaping. It's too sharp on the turn, or it splashes when the pot's too full. And every woodworker had their quirks. Some carved only by moonlight, claiming better grain visibility. Others refused to speak while making the spoon's bowl, fearing it would listen wrong. One fringe tale from 13th century France tells of a carver who made spoons exclusively from trees struck by lightning, believing the storm lent extra stirring power. Historians, as you might expect, still argue whether spoon carving was ever truly ritualized or just filled with superstition from bored artisans. But it's clear there was pride, deep, obsessive pride, in the craft. The man before you gestures to a row of completed spoons propped up like sentries behind him. No two are alike. One is long and narrow, ideal for reaching the bottom of a deep meat vat. Another is squat, wide, almost like a paddle used for canoeing, but thinner, lighter. One spoon even has a twist along its handle, not for beauty, but grip. "Grease," the woodworker mutters. "Handle gets slick. Can't afford to lose control in front of the fire." The fire. Always back to the fire. Every spoon is built with fire in mind. Heat warps, singes, dries out. So the handle's length isn't just about stirring range, it's about not catching fire. You imagine an apprentice, fresh-faced and sweating, reaching too close to a hearth with a short ladle and emerging with eyebrows newly optional. Then there's the bowl depth. Too shallow, and the spoon can't carry enough. Too deep, and it won't drain cleanly. The angle matters, too. A steep bowl works better for lifting, a flat one for scraping. You're realizing this is part science, part obsession. Each curve, notch, and length chosen based on what the spoon will stir. Some woodworkers worked directly with the cook, like tailors with clients. Others carved on speculation, hoping their design would win favor in a noble's kitchen. The most coveted commissions? Spoons with carved end caps, little animals, saints, heraldic crests. Not just decoration, but identity. A head cook could spot their spoon from across the room. And some, of course, just wanted bragging rights. See that one, the carver says, pointing to a particularly elegant paddle, thin as a violin neck and polished to a gleam. That was for a bishop's kitchen. Stirred nothing but fish stew, Fridays only. Of course it did. Another has tiny stars notched up its handle. Every time it survived a feast, she marked it. 14 stars by the end. Not survived as in didn't break, but as in didn't vanish. Because spoons this well made, they went missing. Sometimes borrowed. Sometimes stolen. Occasionally, worshipped. There's one surviving manuscript from a Scottish priory where a carved spoon was rumored to bring great clarity to broths and peace to the stomach. Did the monks believe it? Or was it a joke scribbled by a bored scribe? You'll never know. But the idea of a blessed ladle somehow feels right. Your woodworker gently sets aside the lentil spoon in progress and stands, joints creaking like old floorboards. He dusts off his hands and reaches into a cloth sack. From it, he withdraws a spoon so aged, so darkened with time and fire, that you can't even guess what kind of wood it started as. This one, he says quietly, was my master's. He hands it to you. It's warm, somehow. It smells like rosemary, maybe cedar, definitely years. The bowl is worn thin from thousands of stirs. The handle fits perfectly in your hand. It is, in every possible way, just a spoon. And yet, it isn't. You carry that old spoon in your hand for a while, walking back toward the main kitchen as the air thickens again with the scent of rendered fat and wood smoke. It's not just heat, it's density, a humid, soupy sort of atmosphere that clings to your clothes and slides into your pores. Welcome back to the fire. The hearth roars with life again. A renewed fire has been stoked under the central cauldron, and the room is alive with activity. Cooks move with purpose, sleeves damp with sweat, cheeks flushed from heat. One of them is gripping a paddle spoon as if it's the last thing between her and spontaneous combustion. You notice the choreography of it now, not just stirring, but navigating fire, fat, and fury. Open flames leap from stone grates like they're auditioning for a pyromancer's guild. Pots bubble violently, splashing thick stew like medieval lava. A spit groans under the weight of something unidentifiable but definitely mammalian. And through it all, the spoons, those absurdly long wooden arms, reach in and control the chaos. The design suddenly makes visceral sense. With a 3 to 4 foot handle, the cook stays out of the burn zone. It's not just reach, it's survival. A regular spoon would force you to lean into the fire. A medieval cook doing that, they'd last one lunch shift and be permanently flavoring the broth. One cook stirs a massive pot of dripping pork fat. It spits with rage every few seconds, like an angry swamp. She keeps one arm behind her back as she works, using the paddle more like a martial artist than a chef. And when the grease finally pops, a big one, a sizzling splatter, the spoon takes the brunt of it, shielding her just long enough to step back and curse under her breath. It's dangerous work. Everyone here has burns. You notice that now scars along wrists, singed sleeves, even a patch of hair missing from one unfortunate soul's eyebrow region. Fire isn't just a tool. It's a temperamental co-worker with no HR department. And fat. Fat's a villain all its own. Rendered animal fat, lard, suet, tallow was the lifeblood of medieval kitchens. They used it for everything: frying, roasting, baking, sealing pies, making sauces, and occasionally flinging into the air when it all went wrong. A wrong splash of grease on open flame and you've got an indoor inferno. The big spoons aren't just for stirring, they're for staying alive. You step closer to a cook working a low, thick pan of bubbling meat drippings. She's using a spoon more paddle than ladle, flat and slightly curved at the end. It's wide enough to scrape, but still delicate enough to pour. She's doing something halfway between searing and deglazing, scraping browned bits from the iron with methodical, swooping strokes. You ask how hot it is. She grins and says, "Hot enough to boil your thoughts." Then she gestures with her spoon. "This here's my sister spoon. She's never let me down." Sister spoon. Turns out, many cooks named their favorite paddles. Some even gave them charms, ribbons tied to the handle, carvings near the tip, little notches only they understood. Why? Because when you spend hours in front of fire and flying fat, gripping a wooden extension of your body, that spoon isn't a utensil. It's a partner. One fringe story tells of a cook during a summer feast in Bordeaux who had her spoon blessed by a passing priest, an unofficial act, but she swore afterward it kept her stew from burning, even when the fire misbehaved. Historians still argue whether this was pious superstition or the earliest form of culinary placebo. But the beliefs weren't entirely outlandish. In many kitchens, spoons were oiled and maintained like weapons. Handles were waxed to prevent cracking. The bowl was reshaped over time as ware carved it down. Some spoons lasted decades, passed from master to apprentice. One 14th century London guild even required outgoing cooks to leave behind their prime spoon for the next hire. A kind of greasy inheritance. You crouch near the edge of the hearth, watching one apprentice carefully tilt a ladle to pour fat into a smaller dish. The pour is slow, deliberate. One misjudged wrist flick and the oil will arc like medieval napalm. The spoon's extra length is everything. It keeps his soft, probably uninsured skin out of the splash zone. And yet, the real marvel isn't just size. It's angle. Every spoon here is slightly tilted at the head, carved not in a straight line, but curved like a dipping bird. Why? Because the pots are round. And the fire isn't even. You need to move the spoon like a dancer, pivoting, gliding, scooping, flipping. One older cook near the back, clearly someone who's seen more roasts than rainstorms, demonstrates a full circle stir, swinging her ladle around the cauldron's edge without breaking pace. It's elegant. It's mesmerizing. It's also probably the reason her cloak hasn't caught fire this week. You glance at the ceiling. It's black. Utterly black. Centuries of smoke. The rafters are thick with soot and dangling herbs, some charred at the ends. There's no chimney, just a hole near the top where the smoke might escape if it feels generous. You wonder if the soot ever falls down during dinner service. Then decide you're not emotionally ready to know. In the corner, a small boy fans the flames with a bellow. It looks like punishment but is actually an honor. Controlling the fire was a role given only to trusted hands. Get it wrong, and you burn the barley. Or worse, cool the meat too soon and give your lord a stew that tastes like watery disappointment. One of the kitchen maids swipes at sweat on her brow and shouts, "Watch the spit." A burst of flame kisses the edge of the roasting pit. Someone yells. A cook lurches back, dropping a spoon. It clatters, loud, wooden, heavy. And still the stew bubbles. Because that's the thing about this place. Fire never stops. The fat never cools. The cooks never pause. And the spoon? The spoon just keeps stirring. Bigger than logic. Heavier than reason. Longer than your average fish story. And in this blistering, boiling world, it's not just a tool. It's the one thing standing between you and flambéed eyebrows. By now, your clothes are clinging to you with a consistency that can only be described as stew-adjacent. Your hair smells like lamb smoke, and your fingers are starting to feel permanently curled into the shape of a spoon handle. But something new tugs at your attention, a shift in tempo, not in the kitchen's physical rhythm, but in its hierarchy. You start to notice the pattern, who carries what, and more importantly, who doesn't. That guy with the fancy neck scarf, he doesn't carry anything at all. He glides between stations like a food ghost, nodding here, frowning there, occasionally lifting a single brow at a misaligned crust or an underroasted pigeon. Everyone watches him. Everyone waits for him. This is the master cook, the spoonless wizard at the top of the kitchen's food chain. In modern terms, his head chef, operations manager, fire marshal, HR, and therapist rolled into one sweaty figure in slightly less filthy linen. And unlike the bustling apprentices, he no longer touches the giant spoons. He commands them. But he used to wield one, oh yes. You can see it in the way he examines a bubbling pot, one eye narrowed, lips pressed into a line of ancestral disapproval. That's a man who once stirred pottage for a feast of 60 while a dog barked at his ankle and the fire tried to eat his shoes. And then, there are the spoon tiers. Yes. Not all big spoons were created equal. You start to piece together the system. The longest, heaviest paddles, usually assigned to the lowest-ranking cooks, those whose job it is to stir vast cauldrons of grain until their arms resemble siege weapons. Why? Because it's thankless, repetitive, and miserable. Great for training. Great for breaking a person's spirit just enough to make them care about dumpling texture. The mid-sized spoons, carved with slight curves or scooped bowls, go to intermediate cooks, those responsible for sauces, skimming, and the dreaded delicate pause. One wrong angle and a ladle of fish broth lands on the linen of someone with money and grievances. These spoons require finesse, and only cooks with proven ladle control are allowed to wield them. Then there are the smallest of the big spoons, still long by modern standards, but more nimble. These are for plating, portioning, or adding final flourishes. They're kept close, personal, sometimes hanging from a cook's belt like a holy relic. You even spot one tucked into a custom loop stitched into an apron, a kind of culinary quick-draw holster. A spoon hierarchy. Because of course, it's not just a matter of size or rank, it's style, too. Flat versus round. Deep bowl versus shallow. Straight shaft versus curved. Each type has its place, and each cook has their favorite. Arguments flare. You overhear two apprentices debating whether the flat-lipped Turner spoon or the angled gravy ladle is better for veal drippings. Voices rise. A third cook intervenes, swearing by the crescent, which turns out to be a spoon shaped like a crescent moon for reasons no one fully explains. You ask one of the senior cooks about it. That spoon makes the goose glaze behave, she says, dead serious. Flat edge skims. Round edge scoops. The curve redirects the drip. It's geometry and guts. This is not a woman to argue with. You're invited to peek inside the storage chest where the real spoons are kept, those reserved for banquet days or rare dishes. The chest creaks open like it contains royal scrolls. Inside, a dazzling lineup. Every one labeled with tiny tags written in what you swear is calligraphy. 4 sugared wine reduction. 4 mulled quince only. For that time with the Archbishop. This is more than cutlery. It's culture. And each spoon comes with a story. You ask about a strange, fish-shaped ladle made of reddish wood. Ah, says the cook. That's the eel spoon. Only used on feast days when the river yields, and never, never for anything else. Naturally. You do not ask follow-up questions. You are not spiritually ready. And yes, sometimes spoons were inherited, passed down from master to apprentice like sacred relics, with whispered instructions. Stir only clockwise during Lent. If the gravy hisses back, change spoons. You laugh, but everyone in the kitchen takes it as gospel. One fringe account tells of a Welsh cook whose spoon was said to choose its next owner, refusing to balance in the hands of unworthy apprentices, or mysteriously disappearing until a worthy ladle-bearer arrived. It's likely just a tale meant to keep up morale. But it worked. No one touched that spoon unless it let them. Historians still argue whether these stories were genuine expressions of folk belief or early examples of kitchen mythology, rituals born from the raw pressure of trying to feed 200 people with 4 hours and 1 donkey's worth of dried time. What's undeniable, though, is that spoons were status. You witness it in action when a younger cook asks to borrow a mid-level ladle for a delicate bread pudding glaze. The older cook freezes. The room pauses. "Use the backup," he says coolly. "That one's mine." No debate. Just gravity. And suddenly, you remember that silver spoon from earlier. Not just a symbol of wealth, but of authority. If a cook used the wrong spoon in front of guests, or worse, nobles, they weren't just risking a bad pour. They were overstepping their rank. And medieval kitchens were built on hierarchy. The wrong spoon could cause a scene. One recorded case from an Italian court feast in the 14th century describes a head cook storming out of the kitchen after a junior cook used the gold-dipped ladle reserved for His Eminence's apricot broth. The cook was fined, publicly shamed, and temporarily reassigned to boiling cabbage. Which, in this world, is the equivalent of exile. And sometimes, the spoons acted as medals of honor. When a cook retired, they might hang up their favorite spoon, literally, on the kitchen wall, as a reminder of years of labor and flame dodging. Some kitchens displayed these spoons with pride, the same way monasteries displayed holy relics. You find one mounted above the hearth. The tip is worn smooth, the bowl charred at the edges, and a name carved faintly along the shaft, Myra, 1283 to 1312. That spoon stirred 30 winters' worth of meals. Probably survived 2 famines, 5 festivals, and a wedding roast gone terribly wrong. You stare at it for a while. It doesn't gleam. It doesn't shimmer. But it radiates something undeniably earned. And in this world, that's more valuable than gold trim or silver handles. Someone calls for salt. Not just a pinch. A bucket. You blink. A lanky boy hustles past you, carrying a wooden pail filled with what looks like crushed ice but smells distinctly of dried sweat and preserved cod. Salt, white gold of the medieval kitchen. Suddenly, you're in a different realm of cooking. One less about heat and more about alchemy. Because when you're feeding dozens of people, and the only refrigerator you own is a moderately cool stone wall, salt isn't just seasoning. It's life insurance. And here's where the big spoons come back into play, not just as stirrers, but as tools of preservation, preparation, and sometimes, presentation. You watch a cook kneel next to a shallow trough lined with cloth and fish. She dips a long, narrow spoon into the salt bucket, carefully sifting and scattering the crystals over the fillets with a grace that borders on ritual. The spoon isn't just a scoop. Its carved edge lets her spread the salt like snow. Delicately. Deliberately. And she's fast. Like, alarmingly fast. Scoop. Scatter. Flip. Repeat. The trough fills with fish, each layer salted and stacked. The rhythm is mesmerizing, and you find yourself leaning in just to watch her wrists move. "That one's got sea hands," mutters someone nearby, clearly impressed. It's easy to forget, but medieval food wasn't just about roasting and boiling. There was a whole preparation economy behind the scenes. Salting, brining, pickling, steeping processes designed to keep food edible longer than your average diplomatic negotiation. And spoons. Essential in every single step. One cook uses a large, flat spoon with a slotted base, perfect for lifting meat from brine without splashing your entire tunic. Another spoons spices from a jar using a comically long-handled scoop carved so thin it flexes with every shake. She sprinkles cloves into a wine pot like she's performing a magic trick. You half expect something to explode. There's a side table where another set of spoons rests, narrow, deep, and hooked at the end like ladle canes. These are for oil and vinegar. Not drizzling, decanting. Large clay jugs filled with liquid sit too heavy to pour, so the cooks use these spoons to dip and measure, each spoonful poured with the solemnity of a medieval wine blessing. One apprentice mutters under his breath, 3 spoons oil, 5 spoons vinegar, then stir with the moon spoon. The what now? Turns out, the moon spoon is a wide, concave ladle with a circle carved through its center. For spinning air into the sauce, he explains. You squint. That's either culinary poetry or someone messing with the new guy. Either way, the sauce does look fluffier afterward, so you don't press. Fringe accounts from Norse and Germanic kitchens tell of certain spoons carved with runes, allegedly to help with fermentation or ward off spoilage. Whether or not they believed the symbols had power, the practice itself became tradition. Stirring cabbage with the same rune-inscribed spoon every autumn wasn't superstition, it was standard operating procedure. Historians still argue whether the runes were for ritual or merely decorative, but one preserved Danish ladle, found buried beside a pickled herring barrel, definitely had the rune for protection carved in its handle. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe medieval folks didn't want to mess with cursed condiments. You wander toward a section of the kitchen less dominated by fire and more by pungent mystery. There's a shelf of pickling jars, rows of sealed clay pots, some labeled with wax marks, others so old the handwriting has melted into brownish fuzz. Each jar contains something. Onions, turnips, possibly regret. And next to them, a narrow box filled with brine spoons, long, thin, and often carved with holes or slits. The reason is clever. When reaching into salty, soupy jars, these spoons allowed liquid to drain, leaving only the preserved goods behind. You grab one and peer into a jar. The smell slaps you politely across the soul. Garlic, vinegar, and ancient cabbage. You stir gently. A pickle rises. Victory. Further along, you find the dough station. Big spoons live here too, but in flat, wide, paddle forms. These are used to scoop massive blobs of dough from bowls onto baking stones. You watch as a baker with flour in his eyebrows maneuvers a ladle big enough to use as a baby bathtub. He slaps dough with practiced aggression, folds it with the back of the spoon, then uses the handle to carve shallow marks across the surface. For breads, the spoons act like kneading extensions. For batters, they're for folding, fluffing, spreading. Don't punch the dough, he warns his apprentice. Persuade it. You see one spoon engraved with a spiral down its shaft. When you ask, the baker explains it's for spinning thick dough around the handle before flopping it into a mold. You assume this is a joke until he demonstrates it like a magician pulling a trick rabbit from a hat. The dough winds neatly up the spoon and lands with a plop, spiral side up. Some say the spoons affected not just the food, but the people. There's a recorded proverb in one 15th century German recipe book: the hand that stirs with oak will never quarrel with the meat. Scholars debate whether this means oak somehow softened stew or just made the cook feel fancier. Either way, the spoon and what it was made of mattered. And wood wasn't the only material. In this quieter zone of the kitchen, you find a few old spoons made from horn, bone, even bronze. Bone spoons, especially, were used for sticky mixtures, marzipan, pomegranate syrup, sugar paste. The smooth, slightly porous surface helped spread the gloop without it sliding off or soaking in. The most delicate spoon here is only a foot long, tiny by recent standards, but carved entirely from animal horn, curved just slightly at the tip. You hold it up and it catches the firelight, shimmering like aged glass. That one, says a cook reverently, was for rose jam. Only ever touched petals and honey. You blink. This spoon was pampered. A jar sits nearby, cracked open, faint scent of flowers still inside. You dip the horn spoon in and take a small taste. It's sweet, gentle, like a bedtime story. You imagine the cook who used this spoon every spring, waking early, collecting petals in silence, heating honey over coals, stirring gently with the horn ladle, not too fast, not too hot. Because some spoons weren't for chaos. Some were for care. You've now seen spoons scraped across iron, scorched in fire, and slathered with jam. But as you round a bend past the grain storage bins, you find something you absolutely did not expect: music. No, seriously, music. Someone is tapping a spoon against the rim of a barrel in a steady beat. Not a drum beat, exactly. More like a slow waltz meant for boiling turnips. A young kitchen worker with a shock of curly hair and a suspiciously cheerful disposition is humming along, clinking the edge of his paddle spoon as he waits for a pot to finish steeping. You raise an eyebrow. He shrugs. Helps pass the time, he says, and keeps the broth from getting jealous. You nod like that's a completely reasonable explanation. Turns out, spoons weren't only for cooking. They also had their own little legacy in kitchen culture, passed down through song, ritual, and in some cases, believe it or not, dance. In some villages, particularly among the lower classes, wooden spoons, especially long-handled ones, became improvised musical instruments. Held in one hand and clacked against the knee, thigh, or another spoon, they added rhythm to work songs. Even among kitchen staff, those slow, repetitive tasks, skimming cream, sifting flour, stirring thick porridge, were often accompanied by humming or tapping. One fringe account from an Anglo-Norman kitchen describes how cooks would beat the devil from the pot using a rhythmic spoon stir, especially during cold mornings when fingers were stiff and tempers short. Was it percussion? A coping mechanism? Probably both. Historians still argue whether this beat was truly musical or just a form of venting frustration into a cauldron of oats. Either way, the spoon became more than utility. It became ritual. You see this again later, when a cook finishes a batch of spiced carrots and gently lays her spoon across the lid of the pot, handle pointing west. She nods once, as if the task is complete only when the spoon says so. You ask what that was about. She shrugs. My mother did it. Said it keeps the sweetness in. You begin to notice these small customs everywhere. A tap twice on the pot after a stir. A counterclockwise spin before serving. A spoon placed on its back during meat roasting, so the fire doesn't rise angry, one apprentice explains. Is any of it logical? Probably not. But that's not the point. These are the codes of the kitchen. Ways to bring order to chaos. And when you're juggling boiling milk, flaming wine, and nobles demanding their meat in the shape of swans, a little bit of spoon superstition starts to sound like solid strategy. One cook shows you his wake-up tap, 3 sharp knocks with his spoon on the side of a pot before tasting the contents. A habit he learned from his mentor, who swore it settled the spices. And spices mattered. Big spoons were part of infusion, 2 long-handled stirrers used to blend in ginger, saffron, nutmeg, or clove into broths and sauces. Not all at once, mind you. Spice was expensive. So expensive that even a spoonful could equal a week's wages. One famous scandal in 14th century Bruges involved an apprentice caught sneaking saffron using a hollowed-out spoon shaft sealed with wax. Yes, a smuggling spoon. This real piece of culinary espionage led to new kitchen rules, locking up spice chests, assigning named spoons to spice blending, and in some cases, engraving the spoon with marks to identify every stir. One document even described a witness spoon, a long paddle carved with initials that only the head cook could use when mixing royal dishes, to ensure no one interfered with the pot. Some of these spoons were even weighed, just to prevent modification. And while we're on the subject of suspicion, spoons sometimes played a role in poison detection. Now, let's be clear, a wooden spoon won't actually scream if your soup's been laced with belladonna. But some cooks believed that stirring a dish with a special silver or bone-handled spoon would reveal foul play through bubbling, odd smells, or in one fringe theory, the spoon darkening from contact. Historians still argue whether these spoons were functional or placebo. But several high-status kitchens kept a tester spoon reserved exclusively for pre-tasting meals meant for lords or guests of honor. The tester would stir, smell, and sometimes sip, though often it was the unfortunate apprentice who did the actual sipping. Better a cough than a coffin, as one cook puts it grimly. You also find that spoons held a communal role. Some dishes weren't served with plates or bowls at all. One large pot, one ladle, several trenchers of bread, and the cooks simply gathered around and shared. The spoon, passed from hand to hand, became a kind of humble centerpiece. A tool, but also a connector. One such paddle hangs on the wall here. Shorter than the rest, carved thick at the handle for passing. The tip is smoothed almost to nothing. You imagine the hands it's passed through, the mouths it's fed, the laughs, the sighs, the tired grunts. That spoon served more than stew. And then you come to a pot of boiling something. It's thick, it's fragrant, and it's being stirred by the tiniest big spoon you've seen yet. A narrow, deep ladle, just long enough to keep your fingers out of scalding range, but short enough for intimacy. You ask what's cooking. Remedy, says the cook, smiling. For the bishop's stomach. You nod solemnly, unsure what else to do. The medicinal kitchen, often part of the same complex, used its own set of spoons. Often curved differently, sometimes made of antler or tin, these were used for blending herbal mixtures, crushing dried flowers, stirring honey into teas or vinegar into tonics. And just like in the main kitchen, the spoons had rules. Certain herbs required clockwise stirring. Others only ever touched wooden spoons. Some mixtures were started with one spoon and finished with another, to balance the humors. One recipe reel, preserved in a monastic journal, instructs the reader to stir the fennel with the night ladle, lest it sleep too lightly. You do not want to meet a fennel that sleeps too lightly. Before you leave this area, you spot one last ladle hung beside the mortar and pestles. It's carved with birds. A dove at the top. A raven at the base. You ask about it. Balance, the apothecary cook says softly. Spoon knows when to fly. And when to dig. It sounds poetic. Or insane. Or both. But when he stirs the rosemary honey tonic and you catch the scent wafting into the smoky air, it's the most comforting thing you've smelled all day. And you realize, in the middle of a kitchen full of fire, chaos, and clamor, this spoon is for healing. The longer you stay in this medieval kitchen dreamscape, the more you notice how the spoons, yes, even the giant, canoe paddle ones, aren't just shaped by the fire or the food. They're shaped by the feast. Because everything leads to the feast. You smell it before you see it. A shift in the air. Less soot, more spice. The cooks begin to move faster, more precise. There's a growing thrum of urgency, the kind that can only mean someone important is about to sit down and expect their duck to taste like a divine promise and arrive in under 6 minutes. And suddenly, the big spoons evolve again, not just as tools of survival or superstition, but as performers. Yes, you heard that right. Performers. You follow a tray of puffed pastries up a staircase to the main hall. Up here, the The fire is more controlled, the air surprisingly cooler, and the expectations volcanic. Everything from the plates to the napkins is ornate. Servants bustle in clean tunics. There's actual music. And at the center of it all is a long wooden table lined with trenchers, goblets, and, yes, spoons. Not every guest gets one. Forks are rare, knives are personal, and most trenchers are for scooping, sopping, tearing. But a few special dishes, soups, custards, sauces, rare concoctions served in ceramic basins, are spooned. And when that moment comes, the serving spoon steps into the spotlight. You see one now, a foot-long ladle carved from dark walnut, with an engraved silver cap at the end of the handle. The cook who brings it forward carries it like a relic, balanced on a linen-draped hand. She doesn't ladle the stew, she performs the ladling. One smooth, elegant dip. One perfect pour. No splash. No slop. The bowl glistens as the dish hits the table. You glance around. Nobles nod in approval. A monk blinks once, which is basically applause. This spoon wasn't made for fire or frenzy. It was made for grace. Some kitchens had a full set of presentation spoons, long-handled, often decorative, never used for actual cooking. They were for serving dishes at formal tables, sometimes paired with matching utensils. One surviving inventory from a French noble household lists a ceremonial stew spoon with lapis inlay, reserved for Feast of Saint Margaret. Not functional, not practical, but essential. And the cooks knew this. Behind the scenes, they rehearsed. How to scoop just right. How to pour from height without splash. How to hold the handle so the family crest faced outward. Yes. Feasts had spoon etiquette. Break it, and you didn't just risk embarrassment, you risked insult. One German noble reportedly banished a visiting cook for serving lentils with a meat spoon, thus dictionarying both the bean and the beast. Was he serious? Probably. Historians still argue whether the incident was real or exaggerated to mock kitchen politics, but either way, the legend stuck. And then there were the trick spoons. Oh yes. Some nobles, especially those with a taste for drama, commissioned spoons designed not just to serve, but to surprise. One court in Milan had a set of dessert ladles with hollow handles that released rosewater when tipped. Another rumor tells of a Hungarian prince who owned a singing spoon, a handle carved to whistle faintly when stirred in hot pudding. The most outlandish? A ceremonial spoon from Burgundy said to include a hidden compartment that, when revealed mid-feast, contained a tiny carved frog made of sugar. Was it ever used? No surviving records confirm it. But there is an illustration in the margins of a cook's notebook depicting a man fainting into his stew as a frog leaps from a spoon, so, interpret freely. You catch a glimpse of one such spectacle now. A towering dessert, a custard pyramid with syrup rivers, arrives at the high table. And with it, a spoon with a handle taller than the serving girl's arm, painted gold at the tip, with a small bird carved at the top. The cook lowers it with theatrical precision, and the guests watch with mild amusement and quiet reverence. You hear someone mutter, "Ah, the Canary spoon returns." Apparently, it's famous. As spoons sometimes are. And not just for nobles. In some towns, feast day spoons were brought out for the whole community, painted, ribboned, and paraded through streets before being used to serve the poor. One account from 15th century York describes a holy ladle of St. Barthelmaz, dipped into stew and wine to feed the sick and hungry during the saint's feast. Whether the spoon was actually holy or just a polished prop is unclear, but the ritual mattered. Even in religious feasts, the spoon played a role. In monastic kitchens, certain meals were stirred with silent spoons, no speech allowed during the cooking, as a form of penance. The spoons themselves were sometimes marked with crosses or prayers. One Benedictine abbey kept a spoon carved only for Lent, with a fish-shaped handle and "fast in faith" inscribed along the shaft. Back in your current kitchen, another feast tray is loaded. The kitchen porter carefully selects the correct spoon from a rack of labeled options. He grabs the one marked gooseberry cream, left tilt, and tests its balance before setting it on the tray. You raise an eyebrow. "Last time, I used the right tilt," he whispers, "and it dribbled onto the lace. Lady nearly fainted." He says this with the same seriousness one might apply to statecraft. You return downstairs as the rhythm of the kitchen shifts again, courses cycling, dishes returning, new ones sent out. And through it all, the paddles, ladles, and spoons dance their dance. But here's what really gets you. Some of those massive spoons, those canoe paddles of culinary absurdity, they're not just surviving the feast. They're essential to its success. Because the bigger the meal, the bigger the pot. The bigger the pot, the longer the reach. And the longer the reach, the more absurd the spoon. One cook you watch is using a spoon nearly taller than herself to stir a vat of peas pudding. She grips it like a broomstick, leaning into each turn with practiced muscle memory. When she's done, she plants the spoon upright into a barrel of water with a satisfied grunt. It stands perfectly straight. "That one's the feast stick," she says proudly. "We only use it when the guest list hits triple digits." You glance at its warped tip, stained bowl, and heavily taped grip. It's ugly. It's massive. It's possibly older than some religions. But without it, the feast would fail. After the feast, the energy in the kitchen shifts from frantic to dazed. You'd expect collapse, maybe a dramatic fall into barrels of flour, but instead, there's a quiet, methodical pace that creeps in like fog. The spoons, once soldiers in a war of boiling stock and fire, are now slowly, solemnly lined up along a long wooden bench. Welcome to the part no one romanticizes: cleanup. Yes, even in the Middle Ages, spoons had to be washed. And not just rinsed or wiped. These weren't your average dinner forks. These were utensils that spent hours submerged in goat fat, duck gravy, and curdled oat broth. You don't clean that kind of history, you exorcise it. You follow one tired cook, her hair streaked with soot, her apron a kaleidoscope of stain evidence, as she hauls 3 massive spoons to the back courtyard, where the scrubbing takes place. The air smells of ash, wet wood, and something that might have been onion 6 hours ago. There's a large basin of hot water, a pile of coarse cloths, and the unmistakable glint of sand. Yes, sand. Turns out, the medieval world lacked dish soap. So they made do with what they had: ash, sand, stale ale, vinegar, and even crushed eggshells. A gritty blend dumped into a barrel and sloshed around with those same oversized spoons. The first spoon she drops into the tub makes a plunk so satisfying you're tempted to follow it. She grabs a rough cloth, dips it into the sand slurry, and starts scrubbing. You watch as years of char and flavor slowly give way to polished wood. But even then, it's not truly clean by modern standards. A bit of scent lingers. A glisten of oil remains. And that's the point. "These spoons carry the kitchen's memory," she murmurs. "A clean slate spoils the broth." You've reached what might be the most unexpectedly poetic part of the medieval kitchen, the idea that the spoon itself holds a kind of palimpsest. A layer upon layer of meals, seasons, arguments, victories, famine surges, feast surpluses. Wiped, yes, but never fully erased. Some cooks even preferred it that way. In one fringe tale from a Scottish estate, an old stew ladle was never cleaned after solstice festivals. It was simply wrapped in cloth, hung near the rafters, and brought down the next year for the same dish. The idea was that it preserved the flavor and the spirit of the feast. Historians still argue whether that practice was symbolic, practical, or just unsanitary. But even in more refined kitchens, it wasn't unusual for certain spoons to be used only for specific tasks, and left with traces of their last job. A meat ladle might retain a whisper of clove. A porridge paddle might carry a hint of rosemary. These weren't mistakes, they were layers. You trail another cook into the spoon storage room. Yes, there's a whole room. A narrow, high-ceilinged space with pegs on the wall and racks on the floor. Each spoon is placed with care, like a knight returning a sword to the armory. They're organized by size, shape, use, and, because this is still medieval life, by superstition. You spot one spoon hanging higher than the others, tied with a strip of crimson cloth. "What's that one for?" you ask. "Feast days only," the cook replies. "And only if the main dish is feathered." You open your mouth, think better of it, and nod. There's even a small stone shelf holding broken spoons, split handles, scorched bowls, warped shafts. But they haven't been thrown away. They rest gently, some tucked in linen, some wrapped in leather. These are retired spoons. Given honor, not discarded. It feels strangely emotional. One has its tip burned down to a nub. Another is carved with initials now barely legible. One has a jagged break near the center, its two halves reconnected with a band of twisted wire. The repair looks both fragile and eternal. A spoon that broke, but didn't end. They say a kitchen that throws away a faithful spoon gets cursed with bland gravy, someone mutters behind you. Probably a joke. Probably. You ask if any spoons ever leave the kitchen entirely. "Oh, yes," the head cook says. "When someone marries out of the guild, or travels to serve a new lord, or retires, we send them with a spoon of their own." This wasn't just tradition. It was identity. A departing cook was often gifted a special spoon, sometimes engraved, sometimes plain, but always meaningful. It symbolized the meals they'd stirred, the sweat they gave, and the trust they earned. One preserved account from 14th century Cornwall tells of a cook who wore his old spoon tied to his belt like a badge of honor. When he visited his former kitchen, he placed it on the table before eating. Not to use it. Just so everyone knew he'd once wielded fire and survived. And it wasn't always wood. For high-ranking cooks or those who served noble families, farewell spoons could be made of bronze, tin, or even silver. One Italian head cook was reportedly given a spoon with a sapphire in the handle, less for stirring, more for storytelling. And yes, spoons were even buried with their owners. Archaeologists have found burial sites where cooks were laid to rest with their tools. A long-handled paddle beside the leg bones. A ladle near the skull. A cooking spoon across the chest. Simple wood, softened by time. A final, silent ladle resting forever. Why? Maybe respect. Maybe remembrance. Or maybe, just maybe, someone thought that even in the afterlife, you shouldn't show up empty-handed when the soup is served. You step outside for a breath of cool night air. The stars hang heavy above the rooftops. Smoke trails upward from dying fires. The kitchen is quiet now. And for the first time all day, the spoons rest. Except one. You spot it leaning against a barrel. Still wet. Still warm. Forgotten, maybe. Or just letting itself cool down before the next storm. Because tomorrow, there will be more mouths. More meat. More madness. And once again, someone will reach for the big spoon. The rooster hasn't even thought about crowing yet, but already the kitchen is beginning to stir. Shadows flicker as hearth fires are coaxed back to life, and the air carries the faint promise of boiling water and browned butter. You blink at the stillness, expecting rest. But no. The day begins again. And here comes the spoon. Not the same one as yesterday, this one's older. Heavier. Scarred in a way that suggests it's been swung at more than just stew. The cook holding it has the posture of someone who's wrestled with both boar carcasses and existential dread before sunrise. You're about to ask what's on the breakfast menu when he grunts, "Gruel." A timeless classic. And a perfect lens into the daily side of spoon life, the the quiet, repetitive meals that never make it to the feast hall but fuel the real work of the world. Because not all meals are celebratory, and not every spoon is theatrical. Some are just consistent. You watch as he leans into a massive pot, his canoe-sized spoon pushing the porridge in slow spirals. The sound is different now, thick, slushy, like someone folding damp burlap. He stirs without flair, without ceremony, but not without care. Each loop matters. Each turn is muscle memory passed down over generations of morning gruel warriors. There's something almost peaceful about it. You gotta keep it moving or it crusts, he mutters. And if it crusts, it bites back. You take that literally and wisely keep your distance. Unlike the chaos of feast day meals, the daily fare of a medieval kitchen was ruled by predictability. Porridges, soups, basic stews, and day-old bread reheated with broth. The spoons for these tasks were utilitarian, unadorned, and often shared between shifts. You find a whole rack labeled simply breakfast. No vowels wasted. No fancy handles. Just solid wood and relentless dependability. It's here that you learn about the rotation system. Each day, certain spoons are moved to the front of the rack, and others shifted back to rest. A kind of spoon calendar. Why? To ensure even wear. You wouldn't want your barley stirrer burning out midwinter, would you? And there's more. Some spoons are soaked overnight in ale, not for flavor, but to soften the grainy residue caked around the edges. Others are brushed with vinegar to keep rot away, then dried over the hearth like damp laundry. One poor apprentice is even tasked with rotating the spoon tips, meaning he literally spins them halfway through drying so the shafts don't warp. This is not a job. It's an ecosystem. You step outside briefly to the storage shed, where bins of barley, lentils, dried peas, and root vegetables are kept cool. A young cook is filling a pot with dried fava beans, and she does it using a special measuring spoon, wide, shallow, and carefully carved to hold exactly 2 handfuls worth. It's not pretty, but it's precise. 4 scoops per pot, she says. 6 if the Lord's visiting the stables. Apparently, even bin distribution is a matter of diplomacy. The idea that spoons were used to measure ingredients might sound obvious, but in the medieval kitchen, this wasn't just about portion control, it was about power. The cook who held the measuring spoon controlled the budget, the salt supply, the butter rations. Overscoop and you risk famine in a week. Underscoop and you insult the guests. Balance was everything. One fringe account tells of a monastery where a dispute broke out over whose job it was to wield the daily dola, a long spoon used to apportion soup to the brothers. One monk refused to surrender the spoon, claiming divine right. It escalated to the point where the abbey banned the spoon entirely and switched to ladles made of bark. It lasted a month. Historians still argue whether this was a case of ego or early culinary politics. Either way, it proves one thing: spoons could cause drama, even before breakfast. Back in the kitchen, you find a side nook where bread pudding is being assembled, leftover crusts soaked in milk, eggs, and maybe something sweet if the kitchen's lucky. The cook is stirring the mixture with what looks like a paddle fused with a rake. It's flat, perforated, and long enough to reach across the bowl twice. Lets the air in, she says. Makes the pudding lighter. A moment later, she switches to a different spoon entirely, shorter, rounder, like a fat spade. This one's for smoothing, she adds. Don't ask me why. Just is. And just like that, you stumble into one of the kitchen's many unwritten rules. Certain spoons for certain textures. One to aerate. One to press. One to chase the bubbles, which is either poetic or nonsense, depending on who you ask. One of the apprentices chimes in, there's a spoon for whisking eggs. Bent like a hook. You know it's right when it squeaks. He demonstrates, dragging a spoon across a copper bowl until it gives a faint, high-pitched beep. Everyone nods solemnly. That's the sound of breakfast. But breakfast isn't always simple. There are fasting days to consider, whole seasons where the food must be lean, meatless, often cold. And the spoons adapt. You see ladles designed for almond milk, which was used to replace dairy. One even has a notch carved at the lip to pour gently into goblets so it doesn't splash and reveal how thin the mix is. Deception via ladle. Classic. You also meet the egg guy. Every kitchen has one. This fellow carries a belt with 4 different spoons, one long and flat for sliding soft-boiled eggs from the shell, one cup-shaped for serving poached eggs, one tiny slotted spoon for fishing yolks from brine, yes, pickled yolks were a thing, and one that looks suspiciously like a tiny scoop with a spike at the back. For when they won't cooperate, he says, tapping the spike. You never look at eggs the same way again. And throughout all this, you notice the hum. Not of music, not even of voices, but of routine. The creak of spoons against clay bowls. The thunk of wood on wood. The sigh of ladles as they're rinsed and returned. It's rhythmic, soothing, meditative. This is the spoon as companion. Not glorious, not ceremonial, just steady, dependable. There every morning, every mealtime, stirring the same pot 1,000 times, never asking for applause. You find one such spoon resting near the grain barrel. Shorter than the others. Heavily stained. Worn smooth by years of porridge and potatoes. No carvings. No name. Just a worker. And somehow, in the hierarchy of the medieval kitchen, that's the spoon you respect the most. The day wears on, and the kitchen shifts once more. Morning meals are cleared, the bread ovens reset, and the air now smells like onions and ambition. A new fire is being stoked, not in the hearth, but in the cooks themselves. Because today isn't just about feeding. It's about testing. You find yourself drawn to the far end of the kitchen, a quieter section, semi-separated by a low stone wall. There, amid sacks of flour and bowls of curdled possibility, the experimental spoons are kept. Yes, really. You might think medieval kitchens were all rigid tradition and inherited technique. And mostly, you'd be right. But in between the porridge and the pottage, there was always a whisper of curiosity. What happens if we mix almond milk and rose syrup? What if we stir clockwise, then counter, then not at all? What if this goose is stuffed inside a trout? And at the center of these culinary shenanigans, spoons. The first one you're shown looks more like a weapon than a kitchen tool. It's long, almost your full arm's length, with a jagged, sawtooth edge carved along one side. What's this one do, you ask? The cook shrugs. Scrapes marrow. Or maybe it just scares the beans into cooking faster. Fair enough. This corner of the kitchen is like an R&D lab, if your scientists all had soot on their noses and deep trust issues with apples. Long story. We'll get there. Here, every spoon has a job, but sometimes, the job is unknown until it's invented. You watch as a young cook carefully balances a slotted ladle over a steaming pot, slowly letting saffron-infused milk drip through in an intentional, almost sacred rhythm. Flavor layering, she says. Too fast and it burns. Too slow and it's sad. You nod like that makes perfect sense. And then you see it, the spoon of spoons. It's not big. Not flashy. In fact, it's downright strange. 4 tiny spoon bowls, all attached to the same long handle, like a branch sprouting wooden tongues. Each bowl is shaped slightly differently, one wide, one narrow, one deep, one flat. Testing spoon, the head cook says proudly. For when you don't know which shape the sauce will like best. She dips all 4 into the same pot, then samples each in turn. This one bites. This one floats. This one hides. You blink. The spoon has officially become a mood ring. Some cooks invent their own. One ladle here has a little hole drilled into the tip, not by design, but because the cook liked how it changed the broth flow. Another has a notch worn into its edge, perfect for pouring past the rim of a baking tray. Accidents become assets. Damage becomes design. One particularly suspicious spoon has a weighted handle. When dipped, it always tilts back into the pot unless held at just the right angle. Training tool, someone grins. Teaches balance. Also ruins your week if you're careless. You reach for a nearby paddle with a sharp edge carved into one side. That's a pot corner chaser, explains a cook. For scraping stew out of places it doesn't wanna leave. The ingenuity here is astonishing. You realize the spoon isn't just reacting to the kitchen. It's actively shaping it. One stir too fast, and the milk splits. One dip too slow, and the egg curdles. So, the spoon evolves, not just in size, but in attitude. Some spoons here even have names. You meet Glimmer, a thin, delicate ladle reserved for wine reductions and nothing else. And All Snaggle, a stubby, half-burned mixing stick with a notch so deep it whistles when stirred quickly. The cooks treat them like pets. Maybe even friends. A fringe record from a Catalonian kitchen mentions a tradition called spoon marriage, when a beloved spoon became permanently paired with a specific pot. The pairing was honored, even passed on through generations. You weren't allowed to separate them. Ever. Historians still argue whether that was symbolic or actual kitchen lore, but several cooking texts do include references like, "Only with her true paddle shall the broth agree." Sounds dramatic. Feels accurate. And you know what? There's science in this madness. The size and curve of the spoon bowl affects how much liquid clings with each stir. The length of the handle changes leverage, the thickness changes heat retention, and the wood type can subtly influence flavor, especially if you're stirring something acidic like vinegar or citrus syrup. One cook lets you stir a batch of berry reduction with 2 spoons, one oak, one beech. Same sauce, same motion, but the smell changes slightly with each. Oak adds warmth. Beech brings clarity. Or maybe that's just your brain trying to sound sophisticated around jam. Then there's the trial pot, a battered old cauldron filled with dubious experiments. Right now, it holds something thick, purple, and possibly haunted. The apprentice stirring it looks mildly afraid. "What are you making?" He hesitates. "Possibly cheese." You don't ask follow-up questions. What matters is that even this monstrous stew gets its own spoon, flat-ended, bent at a curious angle, and clearly marked with a red ribbon so no one mistakes it for a real one. Because rules are rules. Even experiments have boundaries. And that's where the story gets deeper. Some spoons were restricted. Not in a ceremonial way, but in a don't touch unless you want to ruin everything way. You learn about the one-ingredient spoons, utensils reserved exclusively for stirring specific ingredients like honey, vinegar, or butter. Why? Because flavors linger. And in a world without soap and stainless steel, one mistake could ghost your entire stew with the flavor of pickled plum. So cooks guarded their spoons. They marked them. They shaped them. They even sang to them. Yes, sang. You hear one now, a slow, repetitive tune hummed by a baker as he mixes dough with a spiral-handled spoon. A simple tune, the kind that doesn't end, doesn't start, just is. Each verse tied to the rhythm of the spoon's spin. Old baker's trick, someone explains, keeps your arms moving even when your head's gone. The song isn't for show. It's a spoon spell. A focus chant. A whispered promise that no matter how weird the mixture, how long the night, the spoon knows the way. And maybe that's what this whole section is about. Because when food becomes experiment, and the kitchen becomes chaos, the spoon isn't just a tool. It's an anchor. A wand. A dance partner. And even if your cheese turns purple and curses your descendants, at least you stirred it with style. You wake before dawn again, because let's be honest, sleep isn't real in medieval kitchens, and find yourself back by the hearth, hypnotized by embers and muscle memory. The cooks shuffle in, some yawning, some already cursing onions. And once again, the spoons rise from their hooks like old comrades called to arms. But something's different today. There's a hush, not of exhaustion, but of anticipation. A buzz beneath the surface, like the air before a storm or a roast duck debut. A cook passes by carrying a scroll, sealed with wax and panic. You ask what's going on. Inventory, he grunts. Ah, of course. It's spoon counting day. Not a feast, not a fast. Just the humble, dreaded ritual of accounting for every single tool in the kitchen. And in a place where your biggest spoons look like ship oars and your smallest ones are shaped like flower petals, this is no small task. The kitchen steward, a wiry man with spectacles older than regret, stands before a ledger the size of a cartwheel. He clears his throat. Bring forth the long-handled stirrers. And so begins the ritual of the roll call. The spoons arrive in procession, scrubbed, polished, and lined up like soldiers. You spot familiar faces, the broth ladle with the chipped rim, the saffron dripper, the glorious wobble spoon from yesterday's pudding experiment. Each is laid out on the bench and inspected, one by one. Burn marks accounted for, the steward murmurs. Shaft integrity, compromised, but functional. It feels absurd. It is absurd. But it's also sacred. Because in a medieval kitchen, spoons weren't just tools, they were assets. Resources. Sometimes even weapons. You think that's hyperbole until someone wheels in the emergency spoon chest. Inside, reinforced stirrers. Thick-handled mixing paddles. A ladle that could probably row a small boat. These were for high-pressure moments, kitchens under siege, or feast prep under time duress, when every second mattered and the regular spoons either cracked, burned, or were flung in a fit of panic. One is affectionately labeled the Punisher. I stirred a barley brick with that once, a cook mutters, rubbing their shoulder. Still twitches. The emergency collection even includes an iron-tipped spoon, used mostly to scrape the edges of clay pots too crusted for wooden spoons to tackle. It looks like a crowbar and sounds like regret when it hits the pot. But here's the thing, spoons broke often. Handles cracked. Bowls warped. Tips burned. The life of a medieval spoon was one of trauma and triumph. And so kitchens had their own informal repair stations. You see one now, a small table with carving knives, binding wire, resin, cloth strips, and a bowl of something that might be tree sap or yesterday's pudding. A young apprentice is carefully smoothing splinters from a split ladle, then winding the break with twine soaked in glue. Hold it like you're binding a wound, the senior cook advises. Because it is a wound. A kitchen wound. And spoon triage is no joke. Some spoons even carried repair histories, scratches, initials, notches to indicate who fixed it and when. You see one marked with 3 bands, once after a burn, once after a feast fight, don't ask, and once, allegedly, after it was dropped into a moat during a castle-wide eel incident. That one's known as swimmer. You wonder aloud, why go to all this trouble? Why not just make new ones? The cook smiles softly. A new spoon don't know the pot. And that's when it hits you, these spoons aren't just tools. They're collaborators. You don't discard them lightly. You repair, retrain, and reuse them, because they've already been through the fire. Literally. Even training spoons are given special care. In a small alcove, you find a stack of oddly short, thick-handled spoons used by new apprentices. Clumsy, chunky things. Impossible to stir gracefully. And that's the point. They're designed to be difficult, to train wrist strength, grip, and motion. One apprentice demonstrates. His wrist trembles under the weight, but he keeps stirring. Once you master this, A normal spoon feels like silk, he says, not looking up. Later, you stumble across a ceremony, half real, half joke, where a junior cook is awarded her first real stirring spoon. It's not fancy. It's barely straight. But it's hers. Everyone claps. Even the spoons seem to echo. Then there's the legendary spoons. No one knows if they still exist, but the stories swirl like gravy. One tale speaks of the long ladle of St. Mildred, said to stir 300 gallons of soup without ever chipping. Another speaks of the whispering spoon, which allegedly hummed when dipped into sauces containing basil. A French chronicle even mentions a golden spoon that caused any stew stirred with it to never stick to the pot. Historians still argue whether these were actual objects or just kitchen folklore. But in quiet corners of every castle and inn, someone's got a magic spoon story. And the older the cook, the weirder the tale. You're shown one such relic wrapped in cloth, locked in a drawer. A bent, blackened spoon with an inscription that no one can quite read anymore. The cook lowers his voice. They say it belonged to a woman who cooked for 3 kings and poisoned none. The gold standard, really. But let's not forget the traveling spoons. Some cooks never stayed in one place. Whether due to war, famine, or simply a thirst for better garlic ratios, they moved from castle to castle, into manor, always carrying their personal spoon tucked in cloth or leather. A tool and a calling card. A cook without a spoon? Suspicious. One with a worn, marked, battle-scarred spoon? Hired on the spot. You see one old man now, arriving with a pack and a spoon strapped to the side like a sword. He removes it gently, oils it without a word, and joins the fire without asking where things are kept. The kitchen makes room. The spoon knows where to go. Because in the end, the spoon isn't just about stirring. It's about belonging. It knows your wrist's rhythm, your sauce habits, your panic stirs and victory flourishes. It's there through joy, failure, jam disasters, and triumphant caramel. It's the one thing that never leaves your side, even when the fire burns high and the stew boils over. And as the inventory ends, and the spoons are returned to their pegs, one by one, some honored, some repaired, some awaiting their next call, you realize something. You didn't just learn how spoons were used. You learned why they mattered. The kitchen winds down for the night, but it doesn't sleep. The fires fade to coals, the pots are scrubbed and stacked, and the air shifts to something quieter. Not silence. Medieval kitchens never achieve true silence. There's always a creak, a drip, a snore from the spice apprentice curled near the barley sacks. But there's a softness now. A restfulness. And here, in this dim hush, you find the last of the spoons. It's tucked in a corner, propped upright against a beam. Looks like nothing special. Short handle, faded grain, one side chipped just slightly. But the way the oldest cook in the room glances at it before leaving tells you everything. That's the first spoon. Not the first spoon ever carved, this isn't archaeology class. But their first spoon. The one carved when the kitchen was new. When the walls still smelled of fresh mortar, and the hearth fire was lit for the first time. It's never used anymore. Just kept close. A totem. A relic. Reminds us where we started, someone whispers. You stand beside it, and let yourself think about all the spoons you've met, some like paddles, some like feathers. The ones that balanced feast and famine, the ones soaked in superstition, the ones that stirred not just meals but moments. The ones that learned your wrist, matched your pace, and bore the heat with you. Spoons that left behind stories etched in oil and scorch marks. The last embers glow gold in the hearth. You watch as one by one, the spoons are put away. Not like tools. Like family. Hung gently on hooks. Wrapped in cloth. Kissed by the warm breath of a fire no longer roaring, but still alive. There's even a ritual for it, nothing grand. Just a final wipe with a damp cloth. A whispered word. One spoon gets a knock on the table before it's shelved. Old habit, the cook says. Tells the spirits we're done feeding people. Historians still argue whether spoon rituals were superstition or just deeply ingrained culture. But when you see it for yourself, you don't really care what the textbooks say. You pass the drying racks. One holds a spoon still glistening from its final stir of the day. A shallow ladle, worn to a smooth shine, resting upside down so no spirits can crawl inside overnight. Practical or mystical? You've stopped trying to separate the two. A baker sneaks into the kitchen late and retrieves one spoon from a cloth pouch. It's thin, delicate, with one burned edge and a ribbon tied to the top. She dips it into a bowl of batter, tastes it, nods, and stirs slowly in perfect silence. I only use this one, she says, when I miss my mother. You don't ask more. You don't need to. And finally, in the tiniest shelf, tucked near a stack of plates, you find a spoon the size of a finger. A child's spoon. Clumsy in shape, clearly not made by a master craftsman. Probably carved by a father or mother for their child to hold while watching the kitchen bustle. You imagine the child stirring air beside the soup pot, mimicking movements, dreaming of the day they'll get a full-sized ladle and a pot of their own. Maybe they already have. Maybe they're the one snoring by the barley sacks. And here's the part no one writes down in the fancy scrolls or feast records. The spoons outlast the cooks. A cook gets sick, grows old, leaves, dies. But the spoon remains. It gets passed on, broken, repaired, maybe renamed. But it stirs again, and again, and again. Generations can come and go around a single piece of carved wood. One cook jokes, if this ladle ever tells our secrets, I'm doomed. Another replies, if mine tells the truth, we're all doomed. The laughs are soft, tired, familiar. You sit near the hearth, now faintly glowing. The bench is warm. The smells are fading, clove, smoke, stewed onion. One final spoon rests on the hook above you. It's plain, like most of them. But you reach up, gently take it down, and hold it in your palm. The curve fits your hand like it remembers you. Or maybe just accepts you. Either way, you're home now. And if you listen closely, past the crackle, the sighs, the soft footsteps fading into hallways, you'll hear it. That spoon. It stirs more than stew. It stirs memory. It stirs time. It stirs everything. So now, as the last flickers of fire fade into sleepy orange halos, and the kitchen around you sinks into a deep, well-earned slumber, you breathe in the stillness. It wraps around you like a blanket stitched from 1,000 meals and 1,000 more stories. The spoons are quiet now, resting in rows, curled into shelves and nooks like old cats who've finally stopped chasing the broth. You might picture your own hand reaching for one, just once more, just to feel its smooth, worn handle, the way the wood catches the light in a curve that almost hums. You don't stir anything. You don't need to. The pot has cooled. The stew is long gone. The work is over. There's peace in that. In the hush after labor. In the gentle dignity of a spoon that's done its job. And whether it was the size of a canoe paddle or a tiny tasting scoop no bigger than your thumb, every spoon had its moment. In boiling chaos. In sacred feast. In quiet morning porridge. They've all left behind echoes you can almost hear when you close your eyes. So let those echoes cradle you now. Let the warmth of the kitchen linger just a little longer. You're safe. The fire is low. The spoons are sleeping. And you did just fine.